Take a breath. The torches are lit. The hall is silent. Tonight, the crown is yours. You were born into velvet sheets and silver spoons, but you love the wrong person, or maybe just the wrong gender. There's no word for what you are. Not yet. But they know. The courtiers whisper. The poets hint. And the eyes watching you from the balcony. They've already judged you. You are royal. You are rich. And you are quietly, dangerously queer. This isn't a love story. It's political survival. In powdered wigs and satin gloves. So dim the lights. Straighten your collar. You're about to walk through 5 centuries of secrets, scandals, and silent longing. And if you're still awake by the time we get to the lesbian duel in a nightgown, subscribe and tell me what century you're watching from. Because history never kept your name, but tonight we will. You can call yourself whatever you like. These days the labels are endless. Gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, or just tired. But in history, there were no tidy boxes, no rainbow flags, no hashtags. And yet, people of the same sex loved each other, longed for each other, defied the rules for each other. So what do we call that? Let's start with a gentle truth. History was never straight. It was just quiet. The problem is, modern language loves precision. History doesn't. You want to know who was gay, who was bi, who was just extremely passionate about their lifelong companion who happened to be the same sex and also shared a bed for 47 years. But history shrugs and hands you a love letter signed "Your Eternal Rose" with burning desire, and then stamps it with a royal crest. Helpful. We have kings who shared beds with men, not just once, but every night. Nobles who kissed in public, adopted each other formally, wore matching rings, and buried themselves side by side. We have empresses who exchanged poetry with ladies in waiting and sent one another locks of hair in envelopes sealed with wax. And then, of course, we have their official biographies, which say they were very good friends. Of course they were. Let's be fair to historians, though. Their job isn't to speculate. It's to interpret documents, cultural norms, and context. And for most of history, people didn't write, "I am gay," in their diaries. They wrote things like, "I would rather die 1,000 deaths than live without the warmth of your embrace," and then went off to get married to someone else. Because marriage, of course, wasn't about love. It was about lineage, politics, property. If you were royal, you married who you were told to, not who you actually wanted. So what happens when you're a prince and you fall in love with your footman or an empress, and you're sending your sapphic poetry to the lady who braids your hair? What happens is you get very creative. In medieval Europe, men often wrote love poems to each other, full of longing, jealousy, grief, devotion. Sometimes they meant friendship, sometimes they didn't. But who decides? In ancient Japan, samurai practiced nunshoku, relationships between older warriors and their male companions, and wrote about them openly. In imperial China, cutting off your sleeve so as not to disturb your sleeping male lover became a celebrated metaphor for devotion. And yet, in 19th century Britain, 2 men holding hands could be hanged. Same gestures, different verdicts. That's what makes this so slippery. The behavior hasn't changed much, but the rules around it have. You'll find figures in history who wore gender-ambiguous clothing, who rejected marriages entirely, who built households around same-sex intimacy. But we can't always be sure whether that intimacy was sexual, emotional, strategic, or all three. So what counts as gay exactly? Is it two women raising children together after being widowed? Is it a baron writing poems to his valet and asking to be buried with him? Is it a king who surrounds himself with beautiful young men and lets no one else near? Maybe. Probably. But again, history won't confirm. It will only suggest. And it will do so in Latin. That's the trick. And the frustration. You want clarity. But all we have are gestures, letters, rumors, silences. You want facts. But all we get is tone. A modern reader might say, this sounds extremely gay. And the court historian from 1421 would say, indeed, a very noble friendship. So what do? We listen. We observe. We accept that identity, as we know it, is a modern invention. But human longing is not. Because at the end of the day, whether they called it friendship, companionship, affection, or simply unspeakable, they still felt it. And sometimes they still wrote it down, not in declarations, but in glances, not in confessions, but in careful ink on imported parchment, which is why we're here, to read between the lines, and to follow the threads, even if they lead us into closets lined with silk, guarded by silence, and utterly undeniable. So, get comfortable, because from here on out, the gossip gets historic, and the definitions, well, they're flexible. The court is awake. The fire's been lit. The servants are whispering already. And you're still in bed, beside him. Not your spouse, not officially, just your closest advisor, your most loyal companion, the man to whom you've entrusted your letters, your politics, your thoughts, your heart. And when you rise, you say nothing, because the walls have ears, and the ears work for someone else. Welcome to the royal closet. Not the kind with skeletons, though there are those too, but the kind lined with velvet, scrolls, and strategic ambiguity. Here, intimacy is permitted, just not confirmed. You can hold hands, exchange gifts, even kiss if it's during a performance or a feast, or a particularly emotional hunt. But call it what it is. That's asking for trouble. Royal friendships were more than just convenient. They were necessary. You couldn't govern alone. You needed allies. And sometimes those allies wore lace and had the kind of cheekbones that made the court gossip itself into a coma. But it's a delicate game. Too much affection, and they call it scandal. Too little, and they call it coldness. Somewhere in the middle, in the wine-soaked glances across the table and the private meetings at midnight, lies your real life, the one no one writes down. In French courts, noblemen were allowed favorites. The word itself was a clue. They weren't ministers. They weren't cousins. They were chosen, by heart, by desire, by design. And as long as the state functioned, no one asked questions, unless you started giving them land, or titles, or your wife's jewelry. That's when things got interesting. Historians have dug through royal inventories full of trinkets, rings, robes, and surprisingly intimate letters. One monarch sent his male companion the robe he'd worn to his coronation. Another commissioned a portrait of his favorite holding his hunting falcon, a coded gesture. Falcons don't just hunt. They return. It was all subtle, until it wasn't. There's a long, storied history of courtiers rising fast, too fast, because of proximity to the monarch's affections. And when affection becomes power, it becomes dangerous, because no one minds if the king has a drinking buddy, But when that buddy starts suggesting policy or collecting castles like poker chips, the knives come out. You weren't punished for the feelings. You were punished for acting on them, for giving them shape, influence, consequence. And so, most royals played the part. They hosted dances, toasted marriages, smiled in portraits beside their lawful spouses, while sneaking handwritten sonnets to someone else's bedchamber. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was strategy. In some cases, entire courts knew. The servants certainly knew. The scribes knew, though they phrased it politely. Deep affection, they'd write, or inseparable, or simply beloved. The irony? The less said, the safer it was. But you knew. You always knew. Every morning you rehearse your silence. You speak to him like a confidant, not a lover. You dine beside him without ever touching. You walk past him in public as if he were another noble. And at night, you return to the room no one's assigned him, but everyone knows he sleeps in. The closet wasn't a prison. It was an arrangement. A space where feelings lived quietly behind locked doors and thick curtains. And sometimes it was enough. Sometimes sharing a glance at court was more electrifying than anything else, because secrecy, in the right palace, with the right risk, could feel like power, or at least like survival. And so the passion stayed disguised as poetry, and the power, that always moved under the table. You command the known world. From the edge of Britannia to the sands of Egypt, your word is law. You raise armies, draft laws, stamp coins with your face. But you would trade it all, every last grain of Roman glory, to hear his voice again. You are Hadrian, and you are grieving. But let's back up. Hadrian was no ordinary emperor. He was curious, scholarly, oddly bearded for a Roman, and obsessed with architecture. He loved cities, fortifications, things that lasted. And in the year 123 CE, while touring the empire, he met a boy from Bithynia. His name was Antinous, young, beautiful, private. His origins were humble, but his presence, magnetic. He traveled with Hadrian, lived with Hadrian, appeared in statues beside Hadrian. And if you think that sounds intimate, so did the Romans. There were rumors, not just of companionship, but of love, of devotion, of something deeper than ceremony. Hadrian never married Antinous. That would have caused a political meltdown, but he didn't need to, because actions speak louder than statecraft. And then, Antinous drowned, in the Nile. It may have been an accident. It may have been a ritual sacrifice. It may have been a choice, the kind made when someone knows they've become too important, too visible, too vulnerable. Hadrian was inconsolable. But what do you do when you're emperor and heartbroken? You grieve, architecturally. Hadrian had statues made, not a few, but hundreds. He built temples in Antinous' name, declared him a god, founded an entire city where he died, Antinopolis. No lover of any Roman ruler had ever been memorialized like that. Not wives, not heirs, not even sons. Coins were struck with Antinous' face. He became a deity in the official imperial cult. People prayed to him, built shrines to him, named stars after him. It was grief as governance, love carved in marble. And yet no Roman record ever quite says it. There's no imperial decree that begins, I, Hadrian, loved this man. But the message is in the ruins, in the temples still standing, in the soft curve of Antinous' stone cheek, preserved for eternity. Now, cross the continent, travel centuries backward. You're in Han China, and another emperor is lying beside someone he loves. Emperor Ai of Han is young, scholarly, and devoted to his companion, Dong Xian, a fellow court official, and by all accounts, deeply favored. One morning, Emperor Ai wakes with Dong still asleep across his sleeve. Rather than disturb him, he cuts the sleeve off his robe and rises quietly. That story, sweet, small, human, became a legend. The passion of the cut sleeve. It appears in poetry, plays, paintings. It became shorthand for same-sex love among men. And again, there's no public declaration, no manifesto, just fabric and a gesture. In both Rome and China, the words were avoided. But the meaning? Obvious, palpable in the art, whispered through the centuries. Because when you hold that much power and still choose to love where it's forbidden, every statue, every robe, every silence becomes a confession. You're the emperor, and your name will be remembered for roads, wars, conquests, but your heart, it will be known by a drowned boy and by a torn sleeve. You crowned him Earl. They called it treason. You called it love, and that's where the trouble began. Edward II wasn't supposed to be memorable. He inherited a strong throne, a stable kingdom, and a perfectly respectable wife, Isabella of France, daughter of a king. But Edward had a flaw. He adored the wrong man. Enter Piers Gaveston, a charming knight of middling birth, questionable manners, and an ego large enough to block sunlight. Piers wasn't subtle. He wore brighter clothes than the nobility, took gifts like he was royalty, mocked the lords who expected to be feared, and worst of all, he had the king's full attention. Edward didn't just like Piers, he depended on him, gave him lands, titles, power, let him dominate court life like a royal consort without the tedious business of marriage. The barons were furious, because Piers wasn't just a favorite, he was an outsider with influence. And in medieval politics, that was more dangerous than open war. So Parliament made a polite request. Remove him. Edward refused. So they exiled Piers. Edward cried, literally. And then he brought him back. Twice. You are the king. You could have played it smart. Spread power around. Made alliances. Pretended to listen. But you didn't. You made Piers Gaveston the Earl of Cornwall, a title usually reserved for royal blood. You had him walk beside you at state events. You whispered to him at dinners, while the nobles clenched their goblets hard enough to shatter them. You composed poems for him. You may have even shared a bed. Now, to be fair, not everyone agreed on the nature of their relationship. Some chroniclers called it a friendship. Others were more suspicious. Isabella, Edward's queen, certainly wasn't thrilled. But if it wasn't romantic, it was something worse. Obsessive. And obsession in politics rarely ends well. Eventually the nobles had enough. They captured Piers, held a sham trial, and executed him. Beheaded, in secret, without royal permission. They didn't even bother with the usual ceremony. They just got rid of him. Edward's grief curdled into rage. He never forgave the men who killed Gaveston. He spent years seeking revenge. But the kingdom was watching. Because a king who mourns a favorite louder than he rules a country becomes a liability. Edward spiraled. He took new favorites. Hugh Despenser, for one. We will talk about him next. He alienated Isabella, lost allies, and then lost the crown. Isabella and her new partner, Roger Mortimer, invaded England in 1326. They captured Edward, deposed him, and imprisoned him in Berkeley Castle. What happened next is grim, even by medieval standards. Edward was likely murdered. Some say starved, others say tortured. One chronicler, with a flair for drama, claimed he was killed with a red-hot poker, a symbolic punishment supposedly tailored for a sodomite king. It may not be true, but the fact that it was said tells you everything about how they saw him. Edward II was many things: foolish, loyal, reckless, devoted. But in the end, his downfall wasn't war or scandal. It was love, expressed too loudly in the wrong century. And you crowned him Earl. They crowned you a threat. Because in medieval politics, the heart was the most dangerous weapon of all. You had the king's favor. Then you had a noose. That's how court works. Let's talk about Hugh Despenser, the kind of man who walks into a room and immediately offends half the nobility just by existing. Handsome, intelligent, ruthless, and dangerously close to the crown. After Piers Gaveston's very public removal from the chessboard, Edward II, emotionally bruised but still painfully predictable, found a new favorite. Enter Hugh, younger son, sharp mind, sharper ambitions. Where Piers had been flamboyant and flamboyantly careless, Hugh was calculated, cold, precise. He didn't want Edward's poems. He wanted land, power, legal control. And he got it, not by charm, but by being useful. He handled royal finances, advised on military strategy, and whispered just the right names into the king's ear whenever someone needed to be exiled, imprisoned, or, let's say, gently vanished. He wasn't content with influence. He wanted dominion. He married into nobility, seized estates from widows, bullied judges, and accumulated more land than some royal dukes. And all the while, Edward stood by, blinking serenely, like a man watching his favorite dog eat someone's leg. It worked, for a while. The court loathed him. The nobles feared him. Even Queen Isabella, who was no stranger to power plays, began to turn. Because Hugh wasn't just toxic. He was infectious. He hollowed out Edward's court like a parasite. And when the people began to suffer under heavy taxes and lost lands, guess who they blamed? Not the king. The man behind the king. You. And that's the problem with being too close to power. When the tower falls, it lands on your head first. Eventually, the pressure cracked. Isabella, now fully done with Edward's pet tyrant, fled to France. She gathered an army, found herself a new man, and invaded. Hugh tried to run, tried to disappear, tried to talk his way out, probably with that same smug confidence that once got him half of southern England. It didn't work. They caught him, dragged him through the streets like a trophy, and then they made a point. You know how executions were usually quick? Axe, gallows, maybe a fire if things got theatrical. Not this time. This was a royal performance. He was hanged, but not to death, cut down while still breathing. Then they, and please forgive the visual, disemboweled him in public. Why? Because cruelty was a message, and the message was clear. Don't reach too high. Don't touch the king. Don't become irreplaceable. You had the king's favor. You thought that made you safe. You were wrong. Because favor isn't a fortress. It's a spotlight. And when the world gets angry enough, that spotlight becomes a target. So they ended you, spectacularly, symbolically, and the court took notes. You're the king, God's anointed ruler, defender of the faith, head of the Church of England, and your dearest wife is a man in tight velvet trousers. That's one way to run a monarchy. Let's meet James I, the man who brought Shakespeare to court, united England and Scotland, and also may have been the most dramatic teenage romantic trapped in the body of a 40-year-old man. To be clear, James wasn't subtle. He didn't just have favorites. He gushed. He clung. He wrote letters that would make a Renaissance poet say, maybe tone it down a bit. But let's start at the beginning. James became King of Scotland as a toddler, which, while adorable, was not ideal for emotional development. His father was murdered. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed. He was raised by tutors and politics. So when he finally came of age, inherited England, and was handed absolute power and a wardrobe budget, what did he crave most? Attention, devotion, affection. Enter the favorites. The first major one was Robert Carr, handsome, green-eyed, completely unqualified for anything except walking in slow motion past open windows. James saw him fall off a horse during a joust and fell in love instantly. He nursed Robert back to health, gave him titles, lands, and enormous influence, even though Carr could barely write a coherent letter. But James didn't care. He once wrote to him, "I desire only to live within your arms, my sweet child and wife." Yes, wife. That was the King of England, writing to another man, in 1607. Now, was it romantic? Was it sexual? Was it political? The honest answer, probably yes. But more importantly, it was emotional. Desperately so. James was the kind of man who needed constant reassurance. Carr provided it, for a while. But then Carr married someone else. Not just anyone, but a woman who later poisoned a rival with poisoned tarts. Truly, the drama never stopped. Their relationship soured. Carr fell from grace. James wept. But don't worry, a rebound arrived. And this one? Spectacular. Enter George Villiers. Later known as the Duke of Buckingham, Villiers was everything Carr wasn't. Educated, polished, politically savvy. And, as one observer wrote, the handsomest-bodied man in all of England. He and James became inseparable. And this time, James didn't hold back. Letters from James to Villiers read like a soap opera set in a cathedral. He called him my sweet child and wife, my only joy, and, in case we weren't sure, I love you more than any earthly creature. In one particularly enthusiastic note, he signed off, "Your old dad and husband, J.R." Let that sink in. James signed his name as husband. It would have been funny if it weren't so historically awkward, because the court noticed, the nobility gossiped, and the public began whispering that maybe the king wasn't just eccentric, maybe he was scandalous. But James, he didn't seem to care. He elevated Villiers to the highest titles in the land, Duke, Lord Admiral, and eventually Chief Favorite, which wasn't an official role but definitely should have been. Villiers had access to the king, influence over policy, and enough wealth to redecorate half of England in red velvet. And through it all, James just adored him. Now James was married to Queen Anne of Denmark. They had several children, including the future Charles I. But emotionally, it was Villiers who had his heart. So was James gay, bisexual, emotionally needy, a flamboyant monarch with a flair for excessive compliments? Possibly all of the above. Because whatever the modern label, the truth was this. James I, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, lived in a court where love letters to men were written on royal stationery, sealed with a kiss, and filed away by scribes who were too polite to ask questions. And when he died in 1625, George Villiers wept beside his bed, not as a courtier, not as a subject, but as someone who'd shared more than power, someone who had, for all intents and purposes, been loved. So yes, you're the king. You hold the scepter. You command armies. You write laws. And the person who knows your heart best wears tighter trousers than you do. You steal her rosary and give it to your boyfriend. Again. She's furious, of course. But what's she going to do? You're the king's brother, and she's just your wife. Welcome to the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who made France fabulous, absolute monarchy divine, and repression very stylish. But this chapter, it's not about him. It's about his younger brother, Philippe Thirst, Duke of Orléans, war hero, cross-dresser, husband, royal pain, and possibly one of the most openly queer figures in European royal history. Let's begin at the heels. Philippe wore them. Not just in court-approved fashion, but in towering, ribbon-laced extravagance. He loved wigs, jewels, silks, and occasionally his wife's accessories, which, unfortunately, she noticed. Philippe's first wife, Henrietta of England, once discovered that he had given her rosary, to one of his favorites, as a gift, with a note, possibly scented. Now, to be fair, Philippe didn't hate women. He danced with them, dined with them, occasionally fathered children with them, but romantically, emotionally, he preferred men, openly. He had a long line of favorites, but none more infamous than the Chevalier de Lorraine. Tall, sharp, charismatic, and completely devoid of subtlety, Lorraine was the kind of man who entered a room already halfway into a scandal. He lived with Philippe, traveled with him, influenced his political decisions, and most infuriatingly to Henrietta, competed with her for affection, and usually won. Philippe didn't hide it. In fact, he strutted it. There were complaints, of course, whispered disapproval, snide remarks in court diaries, but Louis XIV, the older brother and reigning monarch, had one golden rule. Let Philippe do what he wants, so long as he doesn't interfere with politics. And what Philippe wanted was lace, parties, affection, and maybe one more war medal. Because here's the twist. Philippe wasn't just the gay younger brother in eyeliner. He was a very competent general. In 1671, during the Franco-Dutch War, he led French troops at the Battle of Cassel and won. Decisively, brilliantly, wearing a fabulous outfit, no doubt. It was awkward for his critics. You couldn't exactly dismiss him as frivolous when he was outflanking entire armies before lunch. So they tolerated him, mostly, because you can mock someone's pearls, but not their battlefield promotions. Still, court life was tense, especially for Henrietta, who endured the indignity of being publicly outshined by a man who preferred her jewelry collection to her company. Their marriage was strained and tragic. Henrietta died young, under suspicious circumstances. There were rumors of poison, of foul play. And yes, the Chevalier de Lorraine was implicated, briefly, but nothing was proven. Philippe grieved and then remarried. His second wife, Elizabeth Charlotte of the Palatinate, a sharp-tongued practical woman, knew exactly what she was walking into. In her letters, she wrote with dry exasperation about Philippe's lovers, his routines, his moods, and the very obvious fact that she was not, and would never be, the center of his world. But she endured. Because Philippe gave her something in return, security. She was a duchess, a mother, a respected figure at court. And he remained himself, loyal to his brother, loyal to his favorites, loyal, in his own theatrical way, to the performance of royal life. He lived openly, extravagantly, unapologetically. At a time when men were executed for private affections, Philippe walked into salons arm in arm with his lovers and demanded compliments on their cravats. He didn't change laws. He didn't write manifestos. But he existed, visibly, boldly, defiantly, and sometimes that's enough to rattle the world just a little. So yes, you steal her rosary. and you give it to your boyfriend. Again, because you're Philippe. And if you're going to cause a scandal, you might as well do it in heels. You loved her. She weaponized your words. That's the price of closeness. At first glance, Queen Anne doesn't look like someone whose personal heartbreak could reshape a nation. She was soft-spoken, religious, constantly ill. She preferred knitting to confrontation, prayer books to speeches, and, unfortunately for her advisors, made decisions based on who made her feel safe. Which brings us to Sarah. Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. Beautiful, brilliant, razor-tongued, and dangerously confident. She didn't just walk into a room, she rearranged it. And Anne? She let her. They met when they were young. Anne a princess, Sarah a lady-in-waiting. The dynamic was instant. Sarah brought energy. Anne brought devotion. They were inseparable, wrote each other constantly, nicknames, endearments, sometimes signed with yours till death. Anne called herself Mrs. Morley. Sarah became Mrs. Freeman. Private personas for a private world. Some historians call it romantic. Some call it intense friendship. All agree it was intimate. Anne confided in Sarah more than anyone. She took political advice from her, shared her secrets, leaned on her like a crutch. And Sarah? She adored the power. Because Anne may have worn the crown, but Sarah steered the room. She pushed Whig policies, promoted her husband, the Duke of Marlborough, and built a fortune alongside her influence. It was a partnership, a bond, a kingdom within a kingdom. But love, whether romantic or platonic, has rules, and Sarah broke them. She grew demanding, impatient, controlling. She spoke to Anne like a subordinate, corrected her letters, publicly. And worst of all, she misjudged the temperature, because while Sarah thundered about policy, another woman, Abigail Masham, whispered kindness. Abigail was everything Sarah wasn't. Quiet, gentle, soft around the edges. Anne noticed. And Sarah noticed that Anne noticed. You loved her, and now she's slipping away. You write to her. She doesn't reply. You confront her. She grows cold. And then, she hands your letter back. Sarah, once the Queen's confidant, found herself locked out, emotionally and politically. Abigail replaced her in Anne's heart, and eventually in Anne's court. It wasn't just personal. It was catastrophic. Sarah's fall from grace led to a seismic political shift. The Whigs, her allies, lost favor. The Tories rose. Parliament changed. Wars changed. And it all started with a broken bond between two women who once wrote, "I can only be happy where you are." After the fallout, Sarah didn't go quietly. She published the letters, revealed their private nicknames, exposed the vulnerability Anne had given her in trust, scandalized the nation, and made sure no one would ever look at their story the same way again. Some readers saw romance, others saw manipulation, most just saw power. Because when you're queen, your heart is never just yours. It's a target, a lever, a liability. So yes, you loved her. You told her everything. And when she turned, she used your love like a dagger. That's not just heartbreak. That's history. You're fencing in silk. Everyone is watching. You smile anyway. Because scandal, darling, is part of the performance. This is the story of Hortense Mancini, niece to Cardinal Mazarin, mistress to a king, duelist, drinker, dancer, duchess, and possibly the only woman in 17th century Europe who could fence in a nightgown, charm a queen, and still make it to breakfast with her reputation more infamous than ever. Let's rewind. Hortense was born in Rome in 1646. Her uncle, Cardinal Mazarin, was one of the most powerful men in France and had no children of his own, so he groomed his nieces like chess pieces, dressed them in silk, married them off strategically, and hoped for political returns. Hortense was the wild card, too clever, too beautiful, far too unwilling to play nice. At 15, she was nearly forced into a convent, and rather than take the veil, she ran. She escaped, literally, from a locked convent window, fled across France, and was eventually married off to Armand Charles de la Porte, the Duke of La Meilleraye. This should have been her final chapter. Rich, married, silenced. But Armand was a devout man, a very devout man. He had the word sin carved into mirrors so she wouldn't admire herself. He painted over nude artworks. He banned milkmaids from milking cows in front of him because it was too suggestive. Hortense was not built for that life. She fled again, this time with flair, disguised as a man, on horseback, across the Alps. She landed in England, powdered, broke, and still scandalously irresistible, which is exactly how she became mistress to King Charles II. Charles adored her. She was bold, funny, unapologetically sensual, and, crucially, not interested in staying quiet. She drank, gambled, smoked cigars, wore men's clothes, had women lovers. She was everything a proper lady wasn't supposed to be, and exactly what made her unforgettable. One of her rumored affairs was with Anne, Countess of Sussex, a royal relation. They scandalized the court with their closeness. Another story, whispered, never confirmed, says she once dueled a lover in her nightgown, with rapiers, over a jealousy, in front of a crowd. You're fencing in silk, the blade flashes, you laugh. Because why wouldn't you? Everyone's already talking. Might as well give them a good show. She wasn't just reckless. She was revolutionary. Her salons became famous. Intellectuals, nobles, adventurers, all came to bask in her orbit. And what made it legendary wasn't just her wit, or her lovers, or her wardrobe full of half-masculine, half-feminine clothing. It was that she simply refused to apologize. She didn't explain. She didn't plead. She lived. And people, especially men, didn't know what to do with that. A bisexual woman, untethered by shame, moving through Europe's courts like a comet in red satin. Eventually, she published her memoirs. Yes, a woman in the 1600s publishing her own story. And not just any story, her story. Affairs, escapes, duels, scandals, laid bare on the page. It wasn't just brave, it was historic. Because most queer stories from this era are buried under euphemism and denial. Hortense's story was a parade. And yes, time wore her down, fortunes faded, lovers aged. But until the end she remained defiant. She died in 1699. But the stories didn't. They never do when you live loud enough. So here's to the Duchess who wouldn't sit still, to the libertine who lit up salons, to the woman who looked at a sword, a scandal, and a corset, and said, why not all three? You're fencing in silk. Everyone is watching. And you smile anyway. You write 200 letters. You say everything, except what matters most. Because to name it would ruin it, would expose it, would end it. So instead, you write around the truth, and hope she can read between the lines. This is the story of Isabella of Parma, an 18th century Habsburg princess born into opulence, duty, and silence. Her portrait is everything you'd expect. Powdered curls, delicate hands, a gown heavy with embroidery. She looks, frankly, like someone designed to be married, and that's what she was. A political pawn from birth. She was married off to Archduke Joseph, heir to the Holy Roman Empire, and future husband of Maria Theresa's eldest son. It was a good match, politically. And emotionally? Well, not exactly, because Isabella's heart belonged elsewhere, to Maria Cristina, her sister-in-law, and possibly her soulmate. Now, in a royal court, affection between women wasn't always questioned. Kisses, hand-holding, sentimental letters, all considered harmless, even charming. But Isabella's letters were different. They weren't just affectionate. They were aching. Over 200 survive, a paper trail of longing dressed in metaphors and desperation. She called Maria Cristina the light of her life, her other self, her dearest love. She wrote, "When I don't see you, my soul is not complete." And another, "I want to be alone with you, to speak without words, to hold time still." They're the kind of letters that walk the razor's edge, so poetic, so careful. You almost wonder if Isabella was writing for her to understand, or writing to herself to survive. Because Isabella was not well. She suffered from depression, crippling anxiety, a sense of displacement in a court that prized obedience over authenticity, and being intelligent, painfully intelligent, didn't help. She played the harpsichord like a master, spoke multiple languages, read philosophy, but none of that mattered once the marriage contract was signed. Her job was simple: produce heirs. And so she smiled, played the role, and wrote. Sometimes 2 or 3 letters a day, each one a love song in exile. You write 200 letters, and they never say, "I love you." But every sentence hums with it. Maria Cristina's responses were fewer, more reserved. Some historians believe she may have returned the feelings. Others argue she simply couldn't afford to. She was the emperor's daughter, and public rumor could destroy them both. So the affection remained coded, a relationship hidden in margins, between commas, beneath the folds of court ceremony. And then Isabella became pregnant. It should have been a triumph. It was her duty, after all, the thing she was brought here to do. But Isabella was terrified. Pregnancy brought her deeper into melancholy. She feared childbirth, feared losing herself. She wrote, "If I die, promise me you will not forget my soul." And then she did. In 1763, Isabella died after giving birth to a stillborn daughter. She was 21 years old. The court mourned. The emperor wept. And Maria Cristina, she kept the letters. She didn't destroy them, didn't hide them. She kept them. And because she did, we can read them now, across the centuries. We can hear Isabella's voice pressed into parchment, still reaching, still trying to say the things she could never say aloud. Not in that court, not in that era, not with the world watching. So yes, you write 200 letters. You pour yourself into every line. You whisper truth through metaphors, and you pray that somehow she hears it. Because some loves don't wear crowns, they carry quills, and if they're lucky, they survive in ink. Some people age into dignity. Philippe I, Duke of Orléans, aged into more velvet. This was a man who treated fashion like statecraft, scandal like currency, and his wife's jewelry box as a sort of vending machine for boyfriends. We've met Philippe before, brother to Louis XIV, wearer of heels, lover of men, occasional battlefield commander. And yes, still the only general in French military history who could lead a cavalry charge and then change into lace cuffs before lunch. This chapter, though, isn't about war. It's about image and what happens when someone decides to turn court life into a catwalk and dares anyone to object. By his later years, Philippe had mastered the role of royal subversion. He wasn't just existing as a queer man in an intolerant world, he was performing it, loudly, visibly, unapologetically. He cross-dressed often enough that the court stopped being scandalized and just started competing with him. And while his brother Louis XIV, the Sun King, was all about controlled opulence and kingly masculinity, Philippe was out here in plumed hats, pearl chokers, and robes that could double as window treatments. He didn't ask permission. He didn't explain. He walked into salons with lovers on his arm and eyeliner on his face. He wore what he liked, said what he pleased, and somehow, amid the powdered wigs and forced respectability, made it all seem inevitable. Even his critics couldn't keep up. They'd whisper, "Of course." Court gossip ran on scandal like a carriage on grease. Did you hear what he wore to the Queen's reception? He gave that ruby brooch to the Chevalier. Again. I think that was her nightgown. But the truth was this. Philippe's audacity gave others cover. Because once a duke can flirt in public, maybe the musicians can hold hands in the garden. Once he hosts salons where men and women both wear rouge, maybe the rules feel bendable. And when he danced, and he did dance, it wasn't just for court entertainment. It was power in motion. A man of status redefining what that status looked like. And that terrified people. Because fashion, after all, wasn't just vanity in Versailles. It was politics. It told the court who mattered, who obeyed, who stood apart. Philippe, draped in forbidden textures, wearing clothes that mocked convention, reminded everyone that he could rewrite the visual code and still be obeyed. And of course, there were the gifts. Oh, the gifts. He gave diamonds to favorites, cloaks to young men whose eyes lingered a little too long. And yes, he continued to re-gift his wife's belongings. At one point, the Queen's own hair combs turned up in the hands of the Chevalier de Lorraine. How did they get there? Let's not ask questions. Because Philippe didn't need discretion. He had immunity, and he wielded it with the flair of a cabaret magician. It wasn't all performative, though. There was pain here, too, veiled behind the silk. His first marriage collapsed under emotional tension. His second wife, Elizabeth Charlotte, often wrote with exhausted amusement about his passions and scenes. And his children, well, they learned early that their father's love language was flamboyant chaos. But despite everything, or maybe because of it, Philippe thrived. He lived into his 60s, stayed close to power, commanded armies, threw balls, maintained influence, and left behind a legacy no one could quite categorize. He wasn't a rebel. He was a royal. He didn't fight the system. He styled it differently. So here's to the man who made Versailles shimmer with a little more truth, who wore femininity like armor, who understood that sometimes, in a world of silence and suppression, a plume, a pendant, and a perfectly timed scandal can say more than any crown ever could. You dreamed of swans. The kingdom gave you chains. They called him the Swan King, the Dream King, the monarch who built castles so beautiful they seemed unreal because, in many ways, Ludwig II of Bavaria never wanted the world to be real at all. Born in 1845, Ludwig was crowned King of Bavaria at just 18. He was tall, shy, impossibly romantic, more in love with art than administration, more fascinated by fantasy than foreign policy. He didn't care for war. He hated politics. He adored Richard Wagner's operas, moonlit walks, and architecture that looked like something out of a fevered dream. And he loved... Well, that's where the court began to whisper. Ludwig's letters to men were florid, intense, achingly emotional. To one male actor he adored, he wrote, "My love for you is so great, it is beyond words." To another, a courtier, "Only in your presence do I feel complete. My heart is yours." He rarely, if ever, expressed such passion toward women. And though he was once briefly engaged, to his cousin no less, he called it off, quietly, carefully. Because Ludwig wasn't just a romantic, he was a king, and kings weren't allowed to ache like poets. But Ludwig, he tried to make the world match his aching heart. He withdrew from court, commissioned castles that spiraled into the clouds, Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee. They weren't fortresses. They were fantasies, marble staircases that led nowhere, chandeliers heavier than carriages, rooms meant only for dreaming. In one castle, he created an artificial moonlit lake. In another, a mirrored hall where you could lose yourself, or perhaps find the version of yourself the world refused to see. And always, the operas of Wagner echoed in the background. Ludwig wasn't just Wagner's patron. He was his lifeline, funded him, housed him, idolized him. Their letters, too, were intimate, if not always romantic, then at least spiritually entwined. But the court was less enchanted. Ludwig's projects drained the treasury. His behavior grew more eccentric. He rarely appeared in public, held midnight sleigh rides, spoke of building new kingdoms in the Alps where imagination could rule. The ministers grew nervous, because Bavaria didn't need a fairy tale. It needed a functioning king. So they took action. In 1886, Ludwig was declared insane by a panel of doctors who had never examined him in person. They signed the papers, removed him from power. 2 days later, he was found dead, face down in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg. Beside him, the body of the very doctor who had declared him insane. To this day, no one knows what truly happened. Murder, suicide, both. The only certainty, the dream had drowned. But what survived were the castles, the letters, the legacy of a man who tried for one brief reign to turn monarchy into art. Ludwig was many things: a king, a recluse, a dreamer, possibly gay, possibly asexual, possibly too tender for a world built on thrones and armor. But above all, he was honest in his longing, even when it cost him everything. So yes, you dreamed of swans, of music and marble and quiet love beneath the stars. But the kingdom, it gave you chains and called it mercy. You win every battle, but the heart? Not so much. Prince Henry of Prussia was many things: a soldier, a strategist, a composer of biting letters. He was also a younger brother, which in royal history often meant living in the shadow of someone else's spotlight. In this case, the spotlight belonged to Frederick the Great, philosopher king, flute player, ruthless ruler, absolute scene stealer. Frederick was the sun. Henry, he was the moon, precise, watchful, and far more sensitive than he was ever allowed to be. Born in 1726 to a royal house that prized discipline above affection, Henry was the second son in a dynasty that expected men to be warriors and women to be quiet. Luckily for them, Henry was a warrior, just not the kind they expected. He was a military genius, quiet, methodical, unshakable in the field. Unlike his brother, who threw armies like dice, Henry preferred strategies that actually worked. He never lost a battle, not one. In fact, during the 7 Years' War, he saved Prussia more than once with cool-headed decisions that Frederick later claimed as his own, and Henry, always the good soldier, swallowed the insult. Because being a second son meant winning wars in someone else's name. But behind the battlefield tactics and polished boots was a man who burned, gently, and usually in private. Henry adored the arts. He collected books, wrote essays, hosted salons, and, more notably, developed deeply emotional and possibly romantic attachments to several male companions. There was Major von Kaffingst, for instance, a dashing, reckless younger officer who caused all kinds of trouble, and who Henry kept near, despite the court's eyebrows launching into orbit. Frederick, predictably, disapproved. Kaffingst was crude, lazy, scandalous. Frederick exiled him. Henry built him a palace. Yes, a literal palace. It had a portrait gallery, a vineyard, probably too many mirrors. Was it love? That's hard to say. Henry's letters to Kaffingst were warm, protective, and occasionally exasperated. More than anything, they reveal a man desperate for loyalty, and often betrayed by it. Because even when Henry loved, and he did love, it rarely ended well. Another of his favorites, Count von Kaiserlink, also had Henry's affection, until he didn't. The prince's emotional investments were intense, but they weren't always returned. You win every battle, but the heart, not so much. Still, Henry endured. He turned to writing. Memoirs, political essays, military treatises. His words were sharp, his insight clear, and beneath it all, you can hear the longing for recognition, for affection, for someone, anyone, to see past the uniform. Late in life, he lived with his longtime companion, Major von Steckow, in a quiet house surrounded by books and silence. They shared meals, landscapes, letters. It wasn't loud. But maybe that's the point. Henry didn't need fanfare. He'd had enough of that from Frederick. He needed steadiness, someone to sit with, someone who wouldn't leave. His personal life never made headlines, and perhaps that was by design. He wasn't flamboyant. He didn't duel in nightgowns or build operatic castles. He simply lived as a man who preferred men, who fought brilliantly and loved awkwardly, who smiled politely as his brothers stole his victories, and found his own triumphs in quieter places. So yes, you win every battle. The field bends to your will. But when it comes to love, you're always just one letter short. The fan flutters, the gaze lingers, the message, never spoken, travels just the same. In Europe's grand courts, where powdered faces and gilded manners masked every true emotion, queerness often existed in the margins. Never center stage, rarely named, but always there, quietly shaping the stories behind the stories. It was the art of implication. In an age where love between men or women was criminalized, or worse, ridiculed, nobility developed a code, a way to live and love without quite saying so. And that code was poetry, posture, and proximity. Letters from one noble woman to another might brim with devotion. You are the joy of my every morning. I dream of you at the window. Romantic, possibly, platonic, officially. The courts allowed emotional extravagance in same-sex friendships. What they discouraged was specificity, and so ambiguity became survival. You could walk arm in arm with your beloved, so long as no one asked what happened behind closed doors. You could exchange portraits, lockets, entire villas, provided it could all be explained as sentiment, not seduction. It wasn't deception. It was performance, and the stage was Versailles, Vienna, Madrid, St. Petersburg. Take your pick. Every palace had its dancers, men whose lifelong companions lived with them for decades, women who declined marriage in favor of a close friend who moved in quietly after her second winter visit. These were lives lived in ellipses. Consider Anne Seymour Damer, English sculptor, society hostess, and lifelong companion to at least 3 women. Horace Walpole once described her as having a masculine spirit, and her statues, many of classical male nudes, spoke volumes about the desires her society preferred not to name. Or Princess Isabella of Parma, whose 200 letters to Maria Cristina hovered just barely outside the realm of confession, every sentence a heart wrapped in silk. There were salons in Paris where queer thinkers gathered under the guise of discussing literature, and Vienna balls where noblemen paired off for dances just 1 measure longer than was polite. None of it was shouted. But none of it was entirely hidden either. This was a world where discretion was the price of freedom, because the law might not knock on your door, but society could close it behind you just as quickly. There were scandals, of course, dramatic falls from grace, a letter discovered, a footman too bold, a jealous spouse too loud. And yet, the system endured, because for every courtier ruined by suspicion, 10 more danced carefully through the rules, cloaked in titles, protected by etiquette. In Spain, Queen Maria Christina's inner circle included noblewomen whose affection for each other lasted lifetimes. In Russia, Catherine the Great's court buzzed with rumors of her female favorites, none confirmed, all whispered. And always the fans, the glances, the coded notes tucked into the fold of a glove, even the language bent to the need. Intimate friendship, companion, soul twin. It was enough to explain everything and nothing, because in the end, what mattered wasn't the truth, but the appearance, and appearances could be staged. What we now call queer identity didn't exist in the way we understand it today. No open pride, no rainbow flag, no official vocabulary. But the people, they were very much there, loving, hiding, navigating, finding moments in gardens and side chambers and handwritten pages where they could breathe, even if only briefly. And somehow, despite the constraints, some of those moments have survived. They're tucked into museum collections, filed away in dusty archives, etched into journals and memoirs and secret wills, proof that even in the most repressive of times, affection, real, romantic, often inconvenient, found its way through. So if this chapter sounds quiet, that's by design, because this part of the story was always meant to be overheard, not announced. They thought you'd leave your legacy in bloodlines. You left it in love. Spain knew her as the 21st Duchess of Medina Sidonia, but history remembers her by another name, the Red Duchess. And yes, that was an insult. At least it was meant to be. Born in 1936 into one of Spain's oldest aristocratic houses, Luisa Isabel Alvarez de Toledo y Maura came into the world with a title, a fortune, and a family tree that traced back to conquistadors and crusaders. But she had no interest in playing the noblewoman. She preferred revolution. While other nobles curated art and attended galas, Luisa Isabel read Marx, blasted Franco's regime, and kept a private archive of banned books, hidden in her family's ancestral palace. She was Catholic royalty with a communist heart, a duchess who joined protests, a titled aristocrat who got herself arrested for opposing fascism. Needless to say, dinner at her estate was never dull. But behind the politics the passion, and the press coverage, there was also Rosa. Rosa Egipciaco, her secretary, her partner, her great quiet love. They met in the 1980s. Rosa worked in her archive, which by then had grown into one of the most important private historical collections in Europe. Together, they preserved centuries of history, and together they made a new one. Because Louisa Isabel wasn't just collecting royal records, she was uncovering suppressed queer history. She spent decades documenting the forgotten, lovers erased from letters, same-sex bonds dismissed as friendship, women who lived as men, men who refused to marry, couples written out of footnotes. She knew their pain, intimately, because for most of her life, her love for Rosa had to exist in the margins. They lived together, worked side by side, shared a life. But in public, Rosa was the assistant. Spain had legalized same-sex marriage in 2005. But tradition, especially aristocratic tradition, doesn't always update with the law. Louisa Isabel's own family refused to acknowledge her relationship. When she made Rosa the sole heir to her estate, lawsuits erupted. Relatives challenged the will, claimed undue influence, insisted the title should pass to someone more appropriate. But Louisa Isabel was, as ever, unmoved. She was dying in 2008, and she knew it. So she made one final decision: a quiet ceremony, a private room. And Rosa, standing there in love and grief. They married, hours before Louisa Isabel passed. It wasn't a grand affair, no fireworks, no parade, just a legal recognition, a final official truth. After decades of hiding in plain sight, she gave Rosa her name, her legacy, her love, carved into history where no lawsuit could erase it. And yes, the family still fought, but the papers were signed, the story was told. Louisa Isabel didn't just preserve queer history, she lived it, defiantly, tenderly, unapologetically. Her palace now houses the archive she built, a labyrinth of manuscripts, letters, forgotten lives, and quiet revolutions. Among them, the stories of people like her, people who dared to love even when the world wasn't ready. They thought you'd leave your legacy and bloodlines. But titles fade. Estates fall into disrepair. Even names get contested. But the truth, the real truth, of who you loved and how, that's the legacy that lingers, not in portraits, but in ink, in records you refuse to let be burned, and in one marriage certificate, signed just in time. You were born into royalty. You choose to be free. India has over 560 princely families. Most have slipped quietly into the modern world, holding titles with no formal power but plenty of ceremony. And then there's Manvendra Singh Gohil, crowned prince of Rajpipla, son of a Maharaja, and the first openly gay royal in Indian history. It's not the kind of title that gets passed down in a will. It's one you earn, with blood, tears, and a very public talk show appearance. Born in 1965, Manvendra's childhood was equal parts silk and silence. As heir to the Rajpipla princely estate, he was expected to uphold tradition, and that meant marriage, heirs, and the polite invisibility of anything personal. His upbringing was conservative, his schooling elite, his inner world locked down tight. By the 1990s, Manvendra had tried to do what was expected. He married a woman, a noble woman. It lasted 1 year. Behind closed doors, he was breaking. Depression, isolation, the emotional toll of living a lie, dressed in royal brocade. And in 2006, the dam broke. An Indian tabloid got hold of the story. Prince is gay. Royal shame. Shocking confession. Except he hadn't confessed anything. He had been outed, without consent, without protection, without even a warning. The fallout was swift and brutal. His family disowned him. Effigies were burned in the street. Religious groups called for his arrest. And yet, for the first time in his life, he felt free, because the secret was out, and with it, the fear. What came next was unprecedented. Instead of disappearing into scandal, Manvendra stepped into the light. He gave interviews, spoke openly, started foundations. He went on Oprah. Yes, that Oprah. 2007. Sitting beside other LGBTQ plus activists, wearing royal white, speaking with quiet dignity, and saying to the world without flinching, "I am a gay prince." It was a moment that shattered stereotypes, not just in India, but globally. A prince who rejected secrecy, who turned exile into activism. And then he did something even more radical. He opened his palace. Literally, he transformed a portion of his royal estate into a sanctuary, a safe house for LGBTQ plus youth in India, many of whom had been disowned by their own families, just like he had. There were beds, books, legal aid, hugs, no judgment, no shame, just healing. And while Article 377, India's colonial-era law criminalizing same-sex relations, still loomed large, Manvendra kept building. When the law was finally struck down in 2018, he wept, but didn't stop. Because the struggle was never just legal. It was social, cultural, familial. It was a fight in every home, every temple, every whisper. And he knew it firsthand. His relationship with his parents remained complicated for years. Public silence, legal disputes, private bitterness. Eventually, the wounds softened. His mother released a statement. His father welcomed him back into the estate. But Manvendra had already made his peace. He didn't need a throne. He had a mission to ensure that no other queer child, royal or not, ever felt alone again. Now in his late 50s, he continues to advocate, marching in pride parades, hosting awareness campaigns, funding educational initiatives. His life is part royal legacy, part activist anthem, and entirely his own. Because some people inherit palaces, and some people turn them into havens. You were born into royalty. You were told how to walk, how to speak, how to love, or not to. But you chose truth, chose exile, chose purpose. And in doing so, you made the crown mean something again, not in gold, but in grace. It began, as many royal stories do, with a quiet announcement in the Daily Mail. No scandal, no exile. Just one sentence: "I have found love." In 2016, Lord Ivar Mountbatten, cousin to King Charles III and great-great-great-grandson of Queen Victoria, became the first member of the British royal family to come out publicly as gay. And no one burned effigies. No tabloids exploded. No distant uncle renounced the bloodline. Instead, Britain mostly said, "Oh, that's lovely," because Lord Ivar's story wasn't one of rebellion or rupture. It was gentler, quieter, a reminder that sometimes progress tiptoes in through the side door, offers you a drink, and asks if it can rearrange a few chairs. Born in 1963, Ivar was raised within the traditional land-owning tier of British aristocracy. He married Penelope Thompson in 1994, and together they had 3 daughters. For years, he played the part well: husband, father, estate manager of Bridwell Park. But inside, the truth waited. He knew he was gay, had known since adolescence. But like so many of his generation, especially those raised in the velvet and veranda world of the British upper class, he stayed silent. Until he didn't. In his 50s, divorced but on good terms with his ex-wife, Ivar met James Coyle, a flight attendant he described as warm, grounded, and impossibly kind. And something shifted. He no longer wanted to explain himself away. He no longer needed to blend into polite invisibility. So he came out. Not loudly, not with banners, just truthfully. In interviews, he was measured and thoughtful. He didn't disown his past, didn't erase his marriage. He simply added another chapter and introduced the world to the man he loved. 2 years later, in 2018, they got married. It was a small ceremony, close friends, supportive family, good shoes. And at the center of it, Penelope, his ex-wife, who gave him away at the altar. Yes, the woman he'd once married walked him down the aisle to his husband. If there's a better metaphor for modern royal evolution, we haven't found it. The wedding wasn't held in a cathedral. There were no carriages, no trumpets, no Buckingham wave, just love, and maybe some very expensive champagne. It was the first same-sex wedding in British royal history. And yet, it didn't feel like a rupture. It felt like an update. And Lord Ivar was refreshingly down to earth about it all. He joked in interviews, wore a velvet jacket, beamed like a teenager at prom. There were no headlines about disgrace, no ministerial hand-wringing, no nervous courtiers adjusting portraits. Because this wasn't the 18th century. And it turns out, sometimes the monarchy doesn't need a revolution. It just needs someone to quietly go first. Ivar and James now live between their estate and the world, traveling, hosting, sharing dinners with their blended family. Their life is normal, which is perhaps the most radical part. Because for centuries, being queer in a royal context meant secrets, scandals, silence. But Lord Ivar's story isn't one of struggle, it's one of timing. He came out in a world finally ready to listen, or at least too distracted by Brexit to be bothered, and he found love in a place where it had once been forbidden, not behind a fan, not coded into poetry, just in daylight. So no, there were no operas written in his honor, no castles, no tragic endings, just a man, a partner, a wedding with laughter, and an ex-wife holding both history and hope in her hands. It wasn't a scandal. It was a celebration, and in the long, complicated timeline of queer royal lives, that might be the most quietly revolutionary thing of all. You were a monarch. You were a scandal. You were never alone. Across centuries, across continents, across courts lined with oil portraits and silverware, no one was allowed to touch. Queerness wore 1,000 faces. It was the emperor building temples to a drowned lover. It was the queen hiding her heartbreak in letters. It was the duchess marrying her partner in the final hours of her life. It was a fan, a glance, a velvet ribbon exchanged in defiance of silence. And what it meant depended entirely on where you stood. For some, it meant exile, banished, stripped of titles, forgotten in official histories. For others, it meant quiet power, the kind exercised behind closed doors, where favorites whispered into royal ears and changed the course of nations. It meant risk and strategy and hope, tucked into a glove with someone else's initials stitched inside. Sometimes it was poetry, sometimes it was law-breaking, sometimes it was both, in the same week. But what it was not was new. The idea that queerness is a modern invention, some invention of cities or screens or Western liberalism, collapses in the face of centuries of evidence stitched into court life like invisible thread. There were always people who loved differently, and they were always watching the room a little more carefully. You were born royal. You studied posture before you could spell your own name. You learned diplomacy before desire. And then, desire arrived anyway, uninvited, unrelenting, undeniable. You loved him, or her, or someone who refused the category altogether. And the moment you did, the rules changed. Maybe they whispered, maybe they threatened, maybe they clapped politely and pretended not to notice. But you noticed. The way your letters were intercepted, the way your portraits were taken down, the way your legacy was edited. And still, you loved. You built homes. You hosted salons. You fenced in nightgowns. You risked it all to hear their voice again. Because royal queerness wasn't always about rebellion. Often it was about survival. It was about finding joy in the cracks of expectation. About saying, I will play the role, but the script, that's mine. It meant negotiating with power, not discarding it. Because for many LGBTQ royals, there was no leaving the palace. So they redecorated it instead. A private chamber for your true self, a coded diary entry, a lover employed as a companion, an archive of other people like you, so they wouldn't be forgotten. And in those acts, small and seismic, queerness became part of history. Not just scandal, not just tragedy, but presence. You were always there, in the margins, in the footnotes, in the painting where two hands brush, almost touching. Yes, you were a monarch. Yes, you were a scandal. But you were never alone. Because even when the words didn't exist, the people did. Even when the portraits were misnamed, the truth remained. Even when the letters were burned, the ash lingered. And now they are being read aloud again. Not whispered, not hidden, not footnoted into oblivion, but spoken, named, celebrated. Because the story of royalty was never just crowns and treaties. It was also longing and love and the courage to keep writing, even when no one was supposed to read it. And here you are, still visible, still powerful, still, finally, seen. The palace is quiet now. The tapestries don't whisper anymore. The letters are sealed. The lovers are long gone. But the secrets still echo in the halls. You've made it. Through 500 years of royal scandal, velvet closets, and fan-fluttering subtext. Through sword fights in silk, letters that said too much, and monarchs who dared love the wrong person in the right room. You were crowned. You were queer. And frankly, you were exhausting. Seriously. Couldn't just marry someone appropriate and go to bed? No? You had to throw a gala, build a castle, and write 30 love poems about their earlobes? Fine. That's your legacy now. But also, thank you. Because behind the gowns and powdered wigs was something quietly radical. A refusal to vanish, to be erased, to pretend your heart didn't belong to the wrong gender and the right soul. You didn't always get happy endings, but you left breadcrumbs, letters, portraits, duels, marriages, entire palaces that remember who you really were, even when your family didn't. And somehow, in all that performance, you told the truth. Now the candles are low, the scrolls are rolled up, the queen's closet is closed, again. You've survived court gossip, historical revisionism, and probably 3 moments where your lover's ex tried to have you beheaded. Well done. This has been The Grumpy Historian, where history is slow, inconvenient, and usually half-dressed. Sleep well, unless, of course, you dream in powdered wigs and coded love notes. In that case, you may want to stay awake, just in case your valet finds the diary. Good night.